Hello and welcome to Mining Network. I'm joined today by Andrew Ziemick, Special Advisor and Expert in Manganese at CPM Group. Andrew, thank you for joining the program. First of all, I've seen before that you have called manganese the forgotten battery metal. Why is that?
Well, because nobody talks about it, or now people talk about it, but they haven't been talking about it for quite a long time, and I don't not really why. So the 2000s were the decade of excitement about lithium, then cobalt and nickel, and even today, if you go to various battery events, you will see lithium, nickel, cobalt mentioned on big boards, but nothing about manganese, and that's completely wrong, as you are about to find out.
Why do you think, to begin with, it didn't receive as much exposure at the beginning? Because obviously, I'm right in thinking that manganese has been part of the cathode mix since the beginning of lithium-ion batteries, right?
That's correct. Ever since the first the NMC technology first appeared on the market in 2008, manganese was very much a part of what I call the Trinity of metals, which gave the name to the ternary powders, so three metal powders, and the abbreviation NMC stands for nickel, manganese, cobalt. And in the early batteries, well, there are still many vehicles with these batteries driving around, and we're still producing them. The NMC 111, the 111 stands for one part nickel, one part manganese, one part cobalt. So they were equal partners. And yet nobody talked about manganese, and everybody talked about nickel and about cobalt. And the reason for it is very simple. That's its price, or its cheapness, should I say. Depending on the price relationship at any given time, manganese is between 10 times and 47 times cheaper than cobalt. So what is it to be excited about? That's why nobody talked about it before.
And why do you think Cobalt in particular? Obviously, back in 2017, we did see a huge spike rally in Cobalt. Why do you think that got more attention than even at the time things like nickel and manganese?
Cobalt got all the attention for several reasons. One reason is high price volatility, and if you look at the different graphs of cobalt, you will see how it's jumping up and down and having peaks and troughs and so on. The second thing is its high price, as that was the highest priced component of the copper of the nickel NMC cathode. Cobalt could account for something like between 50 and 60% of the value of the cathode. And thirdly, because it comes from the Congo, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, at least by today, about 70% of cobalt comes from there. And as we all know, it is not the most stable country in the world. You know, it's plagued by civil war, child labor, corruption, and all the other ills of many African countries. So the world EV industry, electric vehicle industry, cannot afford to be just reliant on one single country with all these problems. So that gave the engineers a lot of incentive to engineer cobalt out of batteries, and they've been trying to do that for the best part of the last 5 or 10 years.
And obviously, you're talking about this engineering out of Cobalt. Is that why manganese is getting into the limelight a bit more now? We are definitely hearing a lot more about manganese than we were even a year or two ago. What's the main causes of that?
That is correct. This technical drive to engineer cobalt out of batteries resulted in so-called cobalt-free batteries, or maybe this is not a specifically technically correct term because some of them are still containing some cobalt, but very minute quantities. And this resulted in major car makers, what I call voting for cobalt. So we had Tesla first in September 2020, who said, Elon Musk said, it's relatively easy to produce a cathode with 1/3 manganese and 2/3 nickel or something like that. And then in March 2021, we had Volkswagen having their big battery day. And then they made a significant announcement that they will be using manganese-based batteries for what they call their volume segment. So majority of their electric vehicles will be using manganese-based batteries. And then in July this year, we heard from Stellantis And for those of your listeners who are not following closely the market announcement, Stellantis is a merger of Fiat Chrysler and the former PSA Group, containing many European well-known marks like Opel and on the other side of the Atlantic, Jeep and Chrysler and so on. So Stellantis is 14 brands on both sides of the Atlantic, and those three, Tesla, Volkswagen and Stellantis, between them, they produced 16 million vehicles a year. And all of them have major plans to go electric. So Volkswagen says about 80% of their vehicles in Europe will be electric by 2030. Stellantis said 70% in Europe and 14% in America. And obviously Tesla is forever 100% electric. So we are talking about huge volumes of cars going electric, and those makers of those cars, they are voting for manganese to be based on manganese batteries.
Well, I'm assuming obviously we're moving away from cobalt mainly because of the jurisdiction and the supply side of that market. Let's move into the supply side of manganese. Is there a shortage, or I assume not, because obviously a lot of these car manufacturers are voting for this. I'm assuming there might be an abundance of it out there.
No, there is no shortage of manganese in any sense. In that, to start with, we don't need any new discoveries. We have enough reserves and resources to last for 325 years at current rates of production. So that's the first. Secondly, is much more evenly spread around the world. It's produced in about 10 countries, or much more than 10, many more than 10 countries, but I'm just talking about the main deposits which are being used. And these countries are reasonably stable, like South Africa, like Brazil, like Australia, which is one of the major producers, and there is also production in China. So there is no risk to the security of supply of manganese. So from that point of view, it is not in short supply. But obviously, the cathode maker doesn't require manganese ore. They want something else, and this is manganese sulfate. And that's a very specialized product. To those of you who are not following the manganese market, 90% of the ore is converted into ferroalloys and goes into the steel industry. So those chemical products are a niche, 10%, and within that 10%, only less than 1% goes into batteries. So from that point of view, we have plenty of it. But
I was going to say on the sulfite side, then is there a shortage on there, or on that side of the market?
Yes and no. So there is no shortage of sulfate per se, but there is a shortage of capacity for high purity sulfate. And that's the critical difference, because most of the sulfate produced in the world today is going to agriculture. That's for fertilizers production, and also as a supplement for cattle feed and some other industrial applications. And that is quite, should I use the expression, dirty. It contains a lot of impurities. And the battery makers cannot afford this. They need to have very high purity, and they need to avoid the elements which are harmful to the battery performance, particularly those metals which are have electric conductivity, because they produce micro short circuits within the cathode itself, which degrades the battery life. So the purity is the key here when we are talking about the production of manganese sulfate. And its capacity is mainly concentrated, you guessed it, in China. 90% of the global capacity for production of high purity manganese sulfate is located in China. So we are not quite back to the Congo situation, but still it's just one country on which the whole world relies on. So that's why we need more projects elsewhere, just to spread the risk to the electric vehicle industry.
When you're talking about projects, I assume you're talking about the processing plants of the manganese there, to spread around worldwide. Obviously, some of our viewers who have been following manganese will recognize that the price has shot up around 230% over the last 12 months. Would you say that this is due to the restricted processing capacity that you were talking about before there?
Yes and no. So essentially, when we are talking about the price of electrolytic manganese metal, EMM, This comes in two flavors: the standard quality 99.7% manganese and the high purity 99.9 manganese. These price peaks were caused by changes in the Chinese manganese industry. There is a lot of consolidation going in that industry. Smaller plants are being closed down, production is being cut, bigger companies are investing in more modern technology and so on. So this is one thing which caused this spike. The second thing is very good demand from the steel industry. And finally, yes, batteries have an impact on this as well. However, as I said before, the cathode makers need the sulfate, and the sulfate is a chemical product rather than a metal product, and it lives in entirely different world on its own. And these prices were rising too of the sulfate, but it's a slightly slower rate. They grew by 64% over the last 12 months. So partially the high price is the first sign of the deficit in this manganese sulfate market, and partially it's caused by the events in the steel industry. But nonetheless, the two prices are related, and once the metal prices going up, inevitably with a short time lag, the sulfate prices are going up too.
And with this increase in price, are we seeing existing producers sort of, obviously there's no shortage of manganese out there, like you were saying, there's about 325 years of reserves out there already, so no problems there. But are we starting to see a ramp up from the existing producers with the rise in price to, I guess, capitalize on that?
A lot of existing producers are trying essentially to make the quick buck by selling more to the steel industry. So there is a lots happening there. In terms of manganese sulfate, there is less activity as yet, and this is causing the deficit which we are predicting over the next 10-15 years. If we look at the projects in the pipeline, there are very few of them which are coming on stream in the very near future, and the pace of this increase in supply is much slower than the pace of growth of demand from the battery sector, and that's why we keep talking about the deficit.
And in terms of actually new capacity from the processing side, where are all these new processes being built? Obviously, you were talking about there's a lot in China. I'm hoping that there might be some more popping up around the world.
Yes. So not surprisingly, China is the place where most of it is being built. In the next, say, 5-10 years, they would have double the capacity they have right now. And remember, they account for 90% of the global supply at the moment. There are other projects in different countries. So there are several new sulfate projects in Australia. There is one in Europe. There are two in North America and two small projects in Indonesia. They are at different stages of development. Some of them have only just recently got their first maiden resource statements. They are yet to build their mine and then their processing plant. The experiments they make with the production of sulfate on a lab scale are lab scale. So it's still not 100% certain how it will pan out when they build the industrial scale plants. And most importantly, it takes time. It takes time to build a mine. It takes time to build a processing plant. And most important of all, it takes time to get approved by the battery maker. And this process can take up to 4 years in some cases. 2 years. If you get approved in 2 years, you are very lucky. And you cannot be approved until such time when you are able to provide several tons sample. And those several tons sample don't come from nowhere. You have to build a pilot plant at least, and the pilot plants are usually a few hundred kilos per year or per month. So that's why there are long lead times, and even these projects which are in the pipeline right now, they have been in the pipeline for a while, and still we do not see any new capacity coming on stream before 2025.
And you were mentioning a supply deficit. I don't suppose you'd be able to put a number on it looking forward in terms of what the deficit might look like?
Well, I can tell you some numbers. For more specific numbers and greater granularity, you would have to come and buy our research, I'm afraid. But The global production of the manganese sulfate is about 170,000 tons right now. I'm talking about high purity, not the agricultural grade. And this deficit is for 2030. It will be growing slowly from next year. Actually, this year we have a smallish deficit, but tiny. But from next year it would start growing properly. And by 2030, we see this deficit being between 6 and 7 times the global production today. So is it feasible to produce that much more in 9 years? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, to build a processing plant, it's only about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, the construction process alone. But there's a lot of preparation to construction, and many people have to build the mine first. And there are oxide ores and there are carbonate ores, and one is better suited than the other, and so on and so forth. So we believe the invisible hand of the market will eventually do its trick, and the supply will come on stream. But from where we stand today, this large deficit is looming, and it will definitely be impacting the prices of manganese sulfate.
Okay. Well, something I wanted to touch on actually was other battery chemistries. So we see in the battery space very frequently this substitution game. One of the main perks, as you've been talking about manganese, is obviously the price in comparison to things like cobalt has gone for 47 times lower, which is great. And it's also in a variety of jurisdictions, so you don't have that risk associated with too. So one of the things is, I guess, is it possible for manganese to be sort of dethroned in a way and be replaced by something else in the lithium-ion batteries? And I have heard also that Tesla, for example, are looking at returning to an iron phosphate battery. Is that potentially going to reduce the market share of the lithium-ion battery moving forward?
Yes and no. So it's not a secret. The LFP batteries, lithium iron phosphate batteries, are making a big comeback, particularly for the entry-level vehicles, for the bottom end of the market, because they are cheaper, but they don't provide such a long range for the electric cars like other batteries. And for the first time ever, if I may, say, we had to reduce our forecast for the demand for manganese from the battery sector precisely because of the resurgence of the LFP batteries. But this correction is quite small. This deficit I was talking about will shrink by just 4.7% as a result of the resurgent LFP batteries. The volume of the cars, the vote from those 3 big makers of the cars for manganese batteries makes sure that the demand for manganese is growing. It's with resurgent LFPs is just growing a little bit slower than previously predicted, but we are still talking about massive deficit. So maybe it's not 6 times the world's production, but 5 times the world's production in simple terms. Regarding other chemistries, I think LFP is the only one which is really threatening, if this is the correct word, the manganese, or spoiling the broth or flying the ointment. Other chemistries are not that advanced yet. If we are talking about something completely different, like lithium sulfur or zinc air or other chemistries, they are 10, 15 years from commercialization, and even if they are coming on stream, there will be relatively small quantities. And there is another powerful economic factor to be taken into account, which is, by now we are talking about something like 240 gigafactories of batteries, lithium-ion batteries, by 2030. Many have been built already, others are under constructions, others are in the pipeline, and constructions will start in the next year or two. All these factories are geared for what I call traditional NMC batteries, traditional technology to produce cathodes. These investments would need to give their return on capital. This requires 5, 6, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years. And don't forget about this torturous process of approving a supplier. This cuts both ways. If the car maker, the cathode maker, once they approve the supplier, they are not going to drop them at the drop of a hat only because somebody else is 5% cheaper. So these two criteria, the technical criterion of manganese being good for batteries, and more and more varieties of batteries are using manganese even as just as an addition, plus the need for return on capital on those 240 factories which are being built around the world. This kind of guarantees, quote unquote, that manganese will be in the limelight for the next 10 years at least, if not more. That is why we say that the 2020s will be a decade of manganese.
Yeah, not so much forgotten about anymore then, by the sounds of it.
That's right.
Andrew, thank you so much for shedding some light on this. It's one of those commodities that, as you said, hasn't been covered as much as the others. So I'm sure our audience appreciate it. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And if any of your audience is interested in finding out more about it, we have heaps and heaps of data and information about manganese, particularly manganese in batteries. This is our niche, and you know where to come, cpmgroup.com.